From DLA Piper, this is the U.S. Latin America Panorama Podcast. This podcast series focuses on the latest developments across the Americas and globally, highlighting daily business, legal, economic, and political developments affecting businesses. This episode focuses on an America's forecast for 2025, opportunities and challenges. Our featured speakers are Francisco Cerezo, partner and chair of the U.S. Latin America practice at DLA Piper, and Ambassador Michael McKinley, as they explore the outlook for 2025 across the Americas, discussing key trends, issues, cross-border challenges, and business opportunities shaping the future in the region.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us again today on the DLA Piper Panorama podcast series. We're really thrilled to have a good friend and colleague and collaborator that we work shoulder to shoulder with on a number of things. And every time we reach out to him, we're delighted when he's able to make time for us. It's Ambassador McKinley from the Cohen Group. Many of you know that we did a first podcast with Ambassador McKinley, January of 24. Got terrific feedback, so we're delighted to have him join us today. It's a way also of checking in. You may recall that the first one that we did with Ambassador McKinley, there was an element of almost trying to look into the future. There had been a number of significant events in Latin America, so it was a really thoughtful discussion with him on what we thought would play out over the year. So there's an element now of checking in and seeing where things are. As always, we stay away from partisan politics. These are really more policy discussions. Ambassador McKinley, many of you already know him from the prior podcast and a recent fireside chat that I was privileged to have with him in Miami, which you could also find online. So you're very familiar with him and his background. But just a quick note, Ambassador McKinley had just a distinguished career, almost 40 years with the State Department and the U.S. Foreign Service. He served as ambassador to Peru, to Brazil, Colombia, Afghanistan, actually. So it wasn't only Latin America. He was also senior member of our foreign service with the EU. So he served all over the world and has a really broad and global perspective on current affairs and foreign policy issues. He's a senior advisor at the Cohen Group that we collaborate very closely with them. So we're delighted to have you, Ambassador McKinley. Thanks for joining us. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving and welcome, Ambassador. So we'll try to then also towards the end, there's a lot of speculation and it's very fluid right now because we don't really know exactly how Trump's cabinet and senior positions are going to play out. A number of them, President-elect Trump has a number of folks that he's nominated, as everyone's been able to follow in the press. But there are other key positions that impact foreign affairs that it's yet to be seen. So it's a little bit hard yet to predict, if you will, what U.S. policy will be as to Latin America. Lots of issues, including tariffs and others that are very top of mind. So we'll try to cover a little bit of that at the end, but we're going to really start trying to go through country by country some of the more significant events over this past year of key countries in Latin America that have had some really meaningful political, economic, social changes. So I think we start with one of the ones that we focused a fair amount on earlier this year, when we had our first podcast, which was talking about President Milei. At the time, he had just been recently elected. We know that President Milei is very libertarian. At the end of the day, he's an extreme libertarian, if you will, which as libertarian policies go, it tends to anger and generate strong feelings from both the left and the right. So he's a unique figure in politics, certainly in Latin American politics, very controversial. And he's come in, he rode an anti-incumbent wave in a very tough economic environment in Argentina. And he essentially almost came out of nowhere. So let's just start the conversation, Ambassador. Would love to get your thoughts on President Milei's first year in office, the good, the bad, the ugly, the so-so, what's yet to be seen. And as an open question, what are your initial thoughts now a year into a Milei administration?
So, Francisco, you have it right. We started the year with President Milei, and we'll start at the end of the year with President Milei. And you're right to focus on the anti-incumbency nature of his election last year in Argentina. And there's a temptation, I think, now, especially with results in other countries in the world, and particularly in the United States on November 5th, to put all of these elections together, talk about growing right-wing populism in the globe, and see Argentina through that prism, and President Milei in particular. it's important to also look at President Milei in the Argentine domestic context and to particularly focus on what he's doing to address what was a very serious economic meltdown inside the country, and with no easy answers on hand, whether you were looking at it from the left, from the center, or from the right of politics. And almost a year in, he has a record now which is producing results in stopping Argentina's slide into deeper economic crisis. Inflation rate has gone from a peak of about 25% a month at the beginning of this year to 3% a month. That's still high, but a radical shift from what we saw previously. We've seen much greater confidence that Argentina is no longer headed for default. In 2023 and coming into 2024, there was a great deal of speculation about whether we would see a rerun of the financial crisis that affected Argentina in 2001, 2002, into 2003. And that has not been the case. And there's growing confidence, not just of investors, but international financial institutions, the IMF, in the path Argentina has embarked on. There have been very significant cuts in public expenditure, many of them controversial, to include the elimination of, I believe, 7 ministries or subsuming them in the 11 remaining ministries in the Argentine government. And a lot of sacred cows have been tackled, everything from funding for social programs to reprivatizing companies that had become national state companies, and looking at liberalizing the markets on a host of other levels to include radical deregulation. And the results, repeat, are there to see on the macroeconomic level. But what's been remarkable is the level of support that President Milei has sustained across these radical reforms, and in a situation where the poverty level, the poverty rate, went from 40% of the country's population in January of 2024 to over 50% now. I believe the figure is 53%. And his approval rating remains at somewhere around 51, 52%. And that's an indication that there's a widespread understanding of the need for radical shock to address Argentina's deep structural economic problems, which were also having a dramatic impact on daily life inside Argentina, all the more so with rising debt levels, and if not the world's highest inflation rate in 2023, very close to it. When we take a step back, the question is, how sustainable is this kind of fiscal and economic therapy? And the truth is, in situations like this one, and there have been others in the world over the last 30 years, there really has to be change that begins to gravitate towards the positive in terms of impact on people's well-being, expectations of companies, investors. The country is on a sustained path of reform, that growth will resume, poverty levels will begin to come down, unemployment levels will drop. So we're at the moment where, as we look at the next 3 to 6 months, some of the indices, it will be important for them to reflect changes which suggest a positive orientation and results from the shock program he introduced. There's been a shift in the way he's approached politics domestically. If you take a look at the support his Libertad Avanza party has, both in the Chamber of Representatives and in the Senate, very small, under 40 seats in the chamber out of over 250, 6 out of 72 Senate seats. And what began as a more confrontational approach to the opposition to his policies has developed into a more traditional coalition building on given issues to ensure policies move forward. And we'll see how that continues to materialize. There's also been a shift in the way President Milei approaches Argentina's engagement on the international stage. Those early months saw rhetoric and tensions. Neighboring countries like Brazil, and with important trading partners like China, and certainly issues with the multilateral system in general. Fast forward, and you take a look at the G20 meeting, which just took place in Rio de Janeiro, where President Milei met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And there is a change in the way the government is engaging internationally. And I think it's rebounding to Argentina's benefit on a number of levels, not least as we look at the possibility, finally, of an agreement between Mercosur and the European Union after 25 years of negotiations to reach a trade agreement. And all countries in Mercosur are supportive of closing that deal. We'll see if that happens before the end of the deal. The one holdout in Europe is France. But I think it's a reflection, again, of the Argentine government's approach to promoting growth, economic integration of Argentina in world markets, taking advantage of opportunities that are there, while at the same time addressing the significant problems that exist inside Argentina.
Your observation is very interesting because many of us will remember the 20-odd something years ago, El Corralito, Los Cacerolazos, a period in which there were several presidents in any given year. I remember when it was one after the other. And the street, La Calle Argentina, no, the Argentine street, if you will, the people just turned out. And Argentines aren't shy. Protest is a part of their history and their DNA, and they've overthrown governments by popular protest movements. As recently as in the last couple of decades, we saw a fair amount of that. So that was one of the big questions with whether all of these reforms that he's been making, whether he would have enough time to implement them and get some results before the street turned on him. But interestingly, in my travels to Argentina this past year and speaking with friends and clients in Argentina, he has significant support also of a younger generation. So there's also a bit of a generational divide. I think you see people 35 and over have a greater skepticism and are a little bit more concerned about how quickly. But I think the younger generation, which oftentimes are the university ones, if you will, and are often the ones that seem to be giving him more latitude to implement all these reforms in the hopes that there'll be some stability. But it'll be interesting to see then even how much longer that lasts, because I think a lot of people were surprised that he made it through the year without the street, if you will, turning against him, especially what you had just alluded to. There are still internal pressures because social programs, whether it's from the Kirchnerismo or Peronismo or other parties, are still alive and well. They've not necessarily gone anywhere and they're fully represented. So those tensions are still there. Let me ask you a question before. I know we said we'd leave a conversation for Trump, any speculative conversation to a certain extent of a Trump administration and foreign policy towards the end. But since we're on Argentina, Milei has made some public pronouncements very, very favorable as to Trump himself, and certainly as to Elon Musk and other people that are in Trump's inner circle, if you will, understanding that all of the pieces are not in place yet as to Trump's foreign policy and national security team. But if you had to, I know it's completely speculative, but do you anticipate there will be any dramatic changes in policy between Argentina and the U.S., between a Trump administration, as it were, and as it may wind up shaping vis-a-vis Biden administration?
In terms of Argentina-U.S. bilateral relations, no, I don't think so, because there has been a very significant effort to build, by the way, going back to the first Trump administration and the Macri government, but through Fernandez and now Milei in the Biden administration, to have a strong foundation for the relationship and certainly a very sophisticated appreciation in Washington for the challenges Argentina was facing, particularly on the economic front. And clearly, with the reform program that kicked off with President Milei's election, certainly receiving a fair amount of approval in financial markets, but I also think from governments that hoped that Argentina would be able to right the ship under President Milei at macroeconomic terms. As we go forward, and my first remarks on Argentina were there will be a tendency to look at the ideological alignment of Milei government with the incoming Trump administration. And we'll see that with other governments around the world as well. What I'm trying to suggest here is what's important is first and foremost what governments do for their own countries, for their own people, and secondarily, how they decide to play the game on the international stage. There'll be greater alignment on issues like climate change, Paris Climate Agreement, for example. I think President Milei has indicated the possibility Argentina would also withdraw in the context of a U.S. withdrawal. We've seen tough line on Venezuela, and I believe if there's a tougher line out of Washington on what's happening in Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua for that matter, you'll see alignments. And there's certainly be an alignment perhaps on some basic economic policies in terms of global trade and investment. But I don't think we need to overstate it. It's part of the framework, the fabric of interaction. But ties between the United States and Argentina are already pretty good.
So, because time betrays us, right? We could probably talk about Argentina for another hour easily. So I want to move on, although lots still that we could talk about Argentina and the road ahead. But moving on to Brazil, and maybe I'll ask an open-ended question and just get your thoughts on it. But I mean, they just finished their presidency of the G20, right? And there was just a recent 2024 G20 summit. There's the COP30 is coming up, I guess, next year in Brazil as well. So Brazil this has been its year, right, to be leading certain high profile initiatives this year and then next under a Lula administration. So it's an open-ended question to just pick your brain and get your thoughts on how Brazil is doing, where it's going, and anything, whether it's economic reform and development, climate change. I'll ask you an open-ended question, or how are you seeing Brazil?
Brazil, in economic and political terms and internationally, is at an interesting juncture. Let me start with the economic front. And contrary to the expectation of many, but frankly, in line with the way President Lula governed in his first terms in office, a very responsible approach to macroeconomic management of the Brazilian economy, especially in the post-pandemic context, and in terms of a changing global economic environment. And in that respect, the policies have been not only sustained, but there has been an effort at carrying out reforms which have long been advocated by the business community, especially on the high levels of regulation and taxation, the complexity of the tax regime inside Brazil. And there have been issues with trying to push some of these reforms through the Brazilian Congress. But I think it should be noted that we're looking at a Brazil that continues at the macroeconomic level and in terms of potential reforms and responses to the current global economic environment, largely on the right track, with still the expectation that Brazil could do better in terms of pushing higher growth rates inside the country and perhaps addressing the opportunities that have surfaced because of the changes in the global economic environment. But you do see the government trying to take advantage of it with a much greater emphasis on modernization of the country, on infrastructure, on the tech transformation of the economy. Brazil has many opportunities and hopefully is moving forward with realizing a number of them. I would note on FDI, if I remember correctly, in 2022, Brazil attracted the biggest share of global FDI in that year, highest levels ever into Brazil, continues to have significant FDI flows into the country, which is a sign of confidence in the overall stability of the Brazilian economy. I'm not going to suggest a 2% growth rate is the right place to be. I'm not going to suggest there aren't challenges of some of the proposed reforms. We saw the impact of an austerity package on Brazil's stock market just in the past week, where there was a sudden drop. On balance, the fears that existed in some quarters regarding President Lula's potential management of the economy, I think, have been unfounded. And politically, the country largely stable. I think people focus on what happened on January of 2023 as we move towards the inauguration of President Lula and the attempted overthrow of a legitimate transition. And the court cases are growing. The investigations are expanding. They also are enveloping former President Bolsonaro. We'll just have to see how this develops, where it goes. But I would note that Brazil is a vibrant democracy where there's a vibrant debate on policies, options, politics moving forward internationally. And that's where the G20 is an interesting moment. Brazil, under President Lula, has veered back towards the more traditional Brazilian, and I would say largely Latin American approach of non-alignment or multi-alignment. And I'm saying traditional approach of major economies or countries like Mexico, Brazil, to some extent Argentina, and so on. And more especially so in the context of post-pandemic, growing tensions between the United States and China, Brazil's two most important trading and investment partners, the war in Ukraine, and the conflict in Gaza. Brazil has tried to position itself as something of a facilitator, offering itself to support talks which can lead to a lessening of tensions or peace negotiations in Ukraine, on Gaza, not finding too much of a take-up from the countries or parties involved in these conflicts. But it's important to note that Brazil, under Lula, sees itself again as an actor on the international stage. And I would note that Brazil, notwithstanding its hesitancy to fully take a stand or condemn, at least in the eyes of some in Washington, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, voted at the UN to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, unlike, I believe, India and South Africa, for example. And on Venezuela, in a break with tradition of not taking a position on elections in countries in the Western Hemisphere, has, along with Colombia and with most countries in Latin America, not recognized President Maduro's claims of victory in that election. That's a very significant shift. And the Brazilian government and Brazilian diplomacy has been engaged in trying to push both talks with the opposition, publication of the tabulations from the vote on July 28th, and Brazil has played also in organizations like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which has now expanded to invite 4 other countries into its mix. But Brazil has been extremely careful to not support any effort to turn the BRICS or other organizations into anti-Western organizations, and, for example, blocked Venezuela as a potential member of the BRICS. And internationally, I think with India and South Africa, been important in providing a leavening of some of the messaging that comes out of BRICS conferences, most recently the one held by Russia in Kazan, with 36 world leaders in attendance with President Putin, but with a declaration which really didn't shift very much from what BRICS declarations have done in the past, and didn't veer towards supporting Russian positions on Ukraine, for example. So Brazil, I think, is seeing itself as a leader, spokesperson, the global South in these various fora, choosing certain issues to focus on, sustainable development goals of the UN, ending worldwide hunger, addressing multilateral reforms from the UN Security Council to the IMF and World Bank, and in particular taking a lead on climate change. And there, as host of COP30, you'll see Brazil, which already plays an outsized role internationally on driving the debate on climate change, both because it hosts the Amazon basin, I believe 2/3 of the world's rainforests cover, and because Brazil has been fairly active in pushing greening and energy transition agenda inside of Brazil. Brazil has a strong voice, and I think we'll see that materialize at COP30.
Yeah, I mean, we remain very gung-ho and bullish, if you will, on Brazil. You're aware we launched our DLA Piper Brazil earlier this year. So we're bullish on Brazil. So, wow, time flies and there's so much to cover, and I'm mindful of our time. So just briefly, because you touched on Venezuela already, but just I do want to give an opportunity just to bring it full circle. Obviously, with the election, which many believe was fraudulent, election, Edmundo Gonzalez is in exile now. now his running mate, Maria Corina Machado, remains obviously a tremendously popular figure. But it's been months now, and Maduro's still there, and there's a swearing-in inauguration ceremony scheduled for now in January of 25. But there's also then an incoming Trump administration, and if we were to go by Senator Marco Rubio and possibly Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Venezuela, like Cuba, have been issues that he's focused on a lot. Very hard line that you have to have tough approach towards Cuba and Venezuela. So can you bring full circle your thoughts on the road ahead as to Venezuela, particularly because we should anticipate, especially under a Secretary of State Marco Rubio, perhaps an even more proactively aggressive approach towards Venezuela and probably Cuba as well, but focusing on Venezuela.
On Venezuela, if I can just start by noting, we really shouldn't forget that the elections on July 28 were an absolutely pivotal event, significant, I believe, not just in the context of Venezuela, but Latin America generally, where the vast majority, almost 70% of Venezuelans, defied repression, defied efforts to prevent them from voting, and rejected President Maduro's candidacy for a third term and supported the opposition candidate, Edmundo González Urrutia. And then the government did everything it could to prevent González from being recognized as the winner, claiming victory, refusing to publish the results officially, and stonewalling to include expanded repression of political opponents inside the country, forcing González into exile in Spain, and leaving the standard bearer for the opposition for the last 2-3 years, Maria Corina Machado, in hiding, continuing to try to mobilize opinion inside Venezuela against Maduro's inauguration, at least the way he's proposing to do it, on January 10th, 2025. In that context, what was also remarkable is not just the United States, but most of Latin America, Europe, I already talked about Brazil, but Mexico and Colombia and other countries that Maduro might have been expected to have some acquiescence from, if not actual support, have yet to recognize the results of the election. So we're facing a situation on January 10th in which much of the Western international community has not recognized the results. In that context, what's left to try to do to support the opposition in a situation where the political space is closing? My personal view is there have to be tougher policies on Venezuela. So hopefully there's discussions ongoing now of how to proceed.
Okay, so we have so much to cover. So I want to move to Mexico, and then after that, maybe get, as they say in Spanish, unas pinceladas, your thoughts at least on Ecuador and Colombia, because we could spend an hour on each country in Latin America, but it's impossible. So moving a little further north, in October, we had the new swearing in, if you will, of Claudia Sheinbaum as the new president of Mexico from the same party as Manuel López Obrador's of AMLO's. So the big debate was, is there going to be continuity in policies, right? We had AMLO's government, and since she's from the same party, then part of the big debate has been whether there's going to be continuity or we should expect a departure from some of the policies. We've been seeing the whole issue of judicial reform, labor reform, energy. There's been quite significant and controversial reforms in the last year or two, just as recently as this year on the judicial reform. So there's a lot of anticipation, expectation of, will she have a clear departure from AMLO? Interestingly, I always found curious that even though AMLO and his party are considered to be of the left, and at the end of the day, really more populist than anything else, but a leftist populist party, the clashes didn't seem to be that dramatic with the Trump administration, right? I mean, during the Trump years, myself included, many of us thought that they'd be at loggerheads constantly, Trump being of the right and then AMLO being of the left, if you will. And that didn't seem to materialize. Ultimately, they seemed to be able to make things work, and USMCA happened and whatnot. So we now have Trump coming back again. We now have Sheinbaum, however, who is of the same party, but is now the new president. She has latitude to possibly make some meaningful differences from AMLO. So I'd love your thoughts on the road ahead under Scheinbaum, especially in light of Trump, USMCA, all this call for tariffs, all the tough talk on immigration and building the wall. So would appreciate your thoughts. I ask it as an open-ended, so please.
So, Francisco, talking about Mexico is indeed a subject we could go on for hours on, given the absolute importance of the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States. First point I would note is that the relatively good relationship that existed between President López Obrador and President Trump in his first administration was a reflection of a couple of factors. And one, frankly, was the USMCA had been negotiated successfully, a key objective of the Trump administration, and bringing in reforms, which I think all sides recognized were needed, an updating of the agreements. And that was achieved early on. And second, on immigration, as the numbers continued to rise, there was an agreement, hard fought, but with Mexico, on jointly working to contain the immigration flow towards the United States, and the numbers did come down. In the interim, we had the pandemic, and we've had a very rapidly changing global landscape now. So as we look ahead, what does that portend for relations between President Scheinbaum and a reelected President Trump? There's been some tensions over reforms being carried out inside Mexico on the political level, particularly affecting the judiciary, and with a proposal for the election of all judges inside the country. There's concerns about what that means for investors, for the private sector, for rule of law, implementation of USMCA, and so on going forward. And there's concerns, obviously, about immigration flows that have fallen this year, but have been issue in the first 3 years of the Biden administration. Looking forward, I think what we can envisage very early on are a focus on the following 3 to 4 questions. First, I think we should take seriously the expression of concern by the incoming administration that there has to be significant action on stemming the flow of migrants across the U.S.-Mexico border. And I think this will be raised very directly and early on. And it'll be in the context of what more Mexico can do, but also perhaps of measures the United States will be taking on its side of the border to address the flow. The second concern will be not about Mexico, but about the proposal to impose baseline increases of tariffs of 10% minimum on all goods coming into the United States. How does that impact the agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, where unilateral steps like this presumably are precluded? But we are already seeing some of the concerns manifest themselves in Mexico and in Canada and between Canada and Mexico. Very interesting dynamic at work there. So how that discussion is undertaken, whether the proposal on 10% globally is a threat to attract the attention of our trading partners and leave open the door to resolving issues we have with them, we are going to have to wait to see what happens after January 20th. But I do believe, in addition to immigration, you will have the issue of reconciling tariffs imposed globally with how the USMCA is working at the moment. A third factor I think will be at work is China and growing investment of Chinese companies in Mexico to supply U.S. markets as restrictions, constraints grow on direct trade between China and the United States. I think we're already seeing expressions inside Congress and among some in the incoming administration that the reshoring by Chinese firms, and certainly depending on what sectors they're involved, isn't going to pass the test in terms of limiting Chinese products coming into the United States. And Mexico is a very central part of that equation. So I think that will come into discussion as well. As for other areas of potential contention, And people can go down the list of positions on Venezuela, what happens on other international matters, climate change, and so on. I think these are of lesser importance because the relationship, I repeat, is so fundamental to both countries on so many levels. The people-to-people ties are gigantic. Mexico's our largest trading partner, and that only developed over the last couple of years, but it's been part of a trend line since the pandemic. And we need to be good and strong neighbors. So presumably some of these issues are going to be addressed with that in mind.
So to close, I'm going to ask yet another one of my unfair, loaded, open-ended questions that you could spend 3 hours and still run out of time. I want to try to just get a big picture thoughts on Latin America from you as we close. There are clearly some areas that there's going to be a lot of challenges the year ahead, whether it's Ecuador, how the elections are going to play out there, other areas, Colombia, there's still a fair amount of economic activity. We're still seeing a lot of movement, although a good portion of it is with people diversifying themselves of country risk. That has actually led to interesting economic activity, but it's really driven by a concern for political risk, if you will, and diversifying country risk because of some of Petro's policies and concerns for his government. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of really interesting things happen in Panama under President Mulino, Dominican Republic under a re-elected Abinader. And all of these countries we could spend 2 hours talking about. I mean, what's going on in Dominican Republic is still amazing. It keeps growing, and a lot of really interesting public-private partnership work going. The same thing you could say about Panama. So when you take some of these bright spots, as you could say, Dominican Republic, Panama, and others, and some that are the jury is still out or that people are still a bit on pins and needles, and in closing, maybe spend a few minutes giving your big picture thoughts on Latin America, what perhaps you're bullish on, what is giving you pause and you're watching with a close eye. I'd like to finish that as opposed to, because if we go country by country, then we're going to have to do 10 more podcasts today. So with that open-ended question, would love your thoughts on what has you excited and be really optimistic about, what you're being a little bit more cautious and measured on for the year ahead in Latin America.
So the top line remains economic growth, generating faster economic growth from Central America and the Caribbean through South America. So the focus, certainly for investors and companies looking at the region, has to be on the reforms these countries continue to pursue. It's not just responsible macroeconomic management. It's creating an enabling environment for a different kind of foreign investment, whether it's in technology, whether it's in clean energy transitions, whether it's the production of electric vehicles, the reforms of infrastructure. There's still more work to be done in the region as a whole in terms of opening the door to the opportunities for growth. I think some countries, as you've mentioned, like Panama and Dominican Republic, are ahead of the game on this. Others, not so much. But the macro challenge is getting growth in the region as a whole beyond 2% a year, begin to match what we're seeing in some other parts of the world, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and so on. The second aspect of developments inside Latin America, which I think we're all going to be keeping an eye on, is the relationship of key countries with the United States under a re-elected President Trump. My personal view is that many of the continuities in policy will be there. Support for development, cooperation on immigration, stemming immigration flows, cooperation on law enforcement, a concern about China's growing influence in the region, and investments in infrastructure. We just saw that at the APEC summit with the $3.5 billion opening of the Chancay port. And we'll see perhaps more alignment with some of the like-minded governments on some of the broader international issues, whether it's Israel and Ukraine or others that may surface. But I think certainly in those early months, there'll be a lot of attention on how the relationships develop. I would note that National Security Advisor designate Waltz and Secretary of State designate Rubio are people who know Latin America well, are interested. They're likely to take a harder line on the Venezuelas of this world. So as we look at the moment and the focus on wider trends and working perhaps more collaboratively with some governments on global issues, I really do think we're going to see more continuities than disruptions, with the potential exception of the relationship with Mexico, depending on how the tariff and immigration questions go. I would add that the proposal for the 10% hike in tariffs globally, it's going to depend on region by region, country by country, how big of an impact it has if it were actually implemented, as opposed to the opening salvo in a negotiating period. So I would suggest much of Latin America would view it that way. The third issue, I think, will be a focus on Chinese investment in Latin America. 22 out of 26 eligible countries in Latin America are members of the Belt and Road Initiative. Countries continue to close free trade agreements with China to include close allies of the United States, like the current government of Ecuador. China is the largest trading partner for all of the large economies of Latin America, with the exception of Colombia and Mexico, and China may overtake the United States and Colombia over the next year or two. And I think that will be an issue for discussion. But I would note that Chinese investment continues to significantly lag U.S. direct investment. Last year, inward investment into Brazil, for example, I believe was about $17 billion for U.S. companies, Chinese companies, $4 billion. Perhaps I can close by noting the following. Latin America is more integrated internationally than before. We see it in FDI flows. We may see it with the closing of the Mercosur EU trade agreement. We see it in a pretty active successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, which brings Latin American countries on the Pacific coast in much closer trading and investment relationship with key Asian partners. We see it with the way Canada approaches the region. We see it with sovereign fund investments from the Gulf states in Latin American economies where they see opportunities. And certainly, I think, with the approaches of very different countries in political terms, whether they're Mexico or Argentina or Brazil or Chile or Peru or Colombia, they're all looking to develop more of an international profile moving ahead. If they can join that with the kinds of economic reforms that can help the private sector, it certainly could continue to be a very interesting moment when Latin America has become, again, a key factor for the world with critical mineral production, with key agricultural production, with the opportunities for digital transformation and leading on climate change.
Well, Ambassador, it's always a pleasure, a privilege to share this space with you and to get your thoughts on where we are, where we've been in recent months, and more importantly, the road ahead. So it's wonderful to have you as our guest on this final podcast of 2024 entering into 2025. Thank you for your time, for sharing your thoughts on the road ahead. And I hope to have you back in 2025 because, again, there's so much to talk about that I'm sure we could find some really interesting topics to cover sometime again in 2025. So, again, thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Felices fiestas. And happy holidays to you and to all of our listeners and viewers. Thank you for joining us. Hope you found it as thought-provoking and enjoyable as I did. So, muchas gracias, embajador.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Francisco. Boas festas. Feliz Navidad and próspero año nuevo, and happy holidays to everyone. A real pleasure to be with you again.
Gracias mil. Un abrazo a todos. Gracias.
Thank you for joining us and listening to DLA Piper's U.S. Latin America Panorama podcast. Please be sure to visit and follow us on LinkedIn under DLA Piper in Latin America and via dlapiper.com. If you have topics or speakers you'd like to suggest, please reach out to us at dlapiper.americas@dlapiper.com. Thank you for your interest. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.